rattling on. But I run a master's program in photojournalism and documentary, and we developed an online version of that, which uses kind of community practice concepts as its underpinning metaphor. So the idea is it's a much more horizontal course, which is much more about the tutors on the course, the participants on the course, people coming in from industry, us all kind of working together in a collaborative endeavour to engage with the issues around our practice area. And I think one of the most important things about that is to surrender your own sense of being the sage on the stage, all that kind of, philosophy of being a teacher. You're much more like a co-practitioner, and it's much more of a peer-to-peer exchange where I fully expect, and I would be failing in my job if the participants on my program were not going to be my professional peers in a couple of years' time. So, we do, that happens all the time with us. People that we go through our program, go back into industry, work at a very, very high level, and we're constantly kind of engaging with them as professional practitioners. We invite them back into the classroom as well. So what we built up a kind of pedagogy of collaborative online learning using a variety of online tools, web conferencing, Twitter, Wave, Ning, social networking, so on and so forth. So what we did is we kind of used that model that we developed. We applied for the funding from Jisc, and we basically rolled that out into our professional practice community to build a community of practice around photojournalism. We're particularly interested in the ethical business questions. We're not really interested in what makes a good photograph, although that's obviously part of what we're engaged in. But what we were really interested in was what are the kind of key issues facing our industry at the moment? What are the kind of really problematic, difficult problems, complex problems that we're trying to deal with? And it's obviously underpinned a lot by Etienne's thinking, particularly this cultivating community of practice, which I think one of the very interesting things about this is, and Etienne said this a lot, that this is a theory that started out, as I'm sure you're aware, as an observational, analytical theory, as a way of making sense of the way that people learn socially. So looking at learning as a social process, it's become in many ways instrumentalized. It's been turned into a sort of a how-to-it guide. And as he jokes himself, he says people ring him up all the time saying, oh, I'd like 12 communities of practice by next Thursday, and how much is that going to cost? It's almost like kind of creating a shopping list. Having said that, obviously he and his colleagues, people that work with him, have built up a lot of experience in the rollout process, the building, maintaining, cultivating, and growing a community of practice. And I'm sure most of you are aware of this book, but also his newer book, Digital Habitats, which came out co-written with Nancy White and John Smith. If you haven't seen that one, it's a really good buy. It's really worth buying and really worth reading. A lot of really good how-to information about particularly in virtual environments.
It's much more practical. There is a lot more how-to information in there. It's got, a lot of it's actually available as a PDF just to download anyway. So I'm sure most of you are aware, but I think one of the three key elements in a community of practice are the domain, in other words, a topic that you're interested in. The fact that it's about practice, it's about doing things, it's about kind of getting your hands dirty, getting stuck in. And it's obviously about a community. But one thing we've just been talking about, I'm actually working with Etienne on a workshop program at the moment in a virtual environment. And one of the questions that's just emerged is, how do you create a constellation of communities of practice, a series of communities of practice that overlap with each other, where perhaps you have two communities that share the same domain, same subject, but they have a different form of practice. Or two communities that have the same form of practice, but in different domains. So you might have, neurosurgeons and heart surgeons, they're all surgeons, but actually their practice is quite different. And can you create what he calls a constellation or a landscape of communities of practice that overlap with each other? I think that's one area that's very, very interesting area to explore. One I think that this project's begun to play with are the boundaries between communities of practice and this idea of brokerage. And I think that touches on what you were saying about how do you keep a community of practice fresh, how do you bring in new people, and how do you send your ambassadors or your scouts out, as it were, into other communities of practice to learn from them about what they're doing about things. So it's very much for us about taking what we call aspiring entrants, I'm sure you're familiar with this idea, mixing them together with established practitioners. And as Etienne says, that creates a kind of generational encounter. And I think that's one of the ways to keep a community of practice fresh, is the new members. I think, this idea of Kevin Kelly's of nobody's as smart as everybody. The new member is going to have something to bring that's unique, from a different community maybe. I think that's a good way to energize an existing community. Let the new members bring in their expertise, their understanding from a different area of practice into your community. And that's a great way, I think, to kind of get some freshness and some revitalization into it. And this is and I wish you'd come up with an easier phrase to say than legitimate peripheral participation, but this is this idea of, when you're starting out in a new area, you begin to learn the rules of the game by actively participating in that community
And that participation legitimizes your presence. It's like your kind of entry card. You're getting your membership of the club. Now, I think what's very interesting about this is the way that the web or social networking is accelerating this process enormously. And I think it's allowing us to be much more efficient lurkers in other people's communities. So I think this process of being able to go into somebody else's community, hang around for a while, have a listen into conversations, find out what's going on, bring yourself up to quite a nice level of understanding, and then take all that back again to your own community, I think has been massively enhanced by social media. So, blogging, Twitter, following people's wikis and waves, all these sorts of different tools. It's a fantastic way, and I've done this myself on multiple occasions now. I've gone in, I've kind of scouted out or entered into another community, found out what's going on there, and come back out again. And we started to call this pollination. It's like being a bee flying off into somebody else's flower bed, taking a bit of nectar from it, and then flying back to your own nest and spreading that pollen around. So this is a very interesting concept of this idea of brokerage and working on the edges, I think, of communities. And obviously it's all about tacit knowledge. I think the bulk of what we're trying to deal with here is that kind of soft, squidgy, hard to kind of pin down sort of knowledge. It's a lot about community-based knowledge in that way. And for me, it's mostly about dialogue, debate, and discussion. It's mostly about talking about what we do and really trying to open up a discussion around these issues. And most of what we're concerned with, and I think this is true of many communities, is developing the professional identity of the individuals, but also the community itself. Our practice area is under a lot of stress at the moment, under a lot of pressure from the external world. Digitization, the impact of new media, the impact of citizen photojournalism. We're constantly trying to redefine what is our identity as a professional practice area. Because we're under a lot of pressures from external forces that are trying to sort of almost degrade or destroy the idea of the professional journalist. How do we respond to that? How do we kind of make sense of that? These are just a few. I was kind of brainstorming a bit about ways of trying to think about the kinds of categories you might want to start thinking about if you're trying to build a community. And for some reason I got caught away with the idea of a lot of R's. So these are sort of the realms you might want to work in, the kind of rhythms at which you might want to meet, both physically or online, the sorts of relationships that you need to build, what roles people might have within the community, being quite clear about that, what kind of resources you might have or you might be able to utilize. Respect, I think it's a very important part of this. What respect do you have for your co-community members, and what kind of responsibilities does that membership of that community entail? If you join a community, what do you expect of the community, and what can the community expect from you? I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail, but they're just kind of things to throw out, and we can maybe discuss those if you've got more, if you want to drill down to the end. I'm going to take you on what Etienne would call a virtual visit now into the community that we built. We're going to go on a little sort of tour, as it were, of what we did and how we did it. It's called OpenEye, which stands for Open Photojournalism Education Network, and it's essentially it's an invitation-only network, but we made it very easy for people to invite other people. So we personally invited, when we began it, around the first 150, 200 people. Since then, pretty much all of the invitations have been from that group, and we've now got about 1,000 members altogether in the community. It's a global network. It was very important for us right from the very beginning. This was a group that was inclusive, that included practitioners from all over the world, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, as well as First World, America, UK practitioners as well. So we were quite careful at the beginning of making sure we'd invited people from that kind of global space. Just to give you a flavour of the kinds of things we're talking of the practice that we're actually involved in. These are some photographs by a colleague of mine, Ed Cashew, who's a fairly active member of the community. He's a National Geographic photographer. He also works on long-term documentary projects in America. This is a project about aging in America that he's been working on. This is a project about Iraqi Kurdistan that he shot for National Geographic. I hope you can see these slides. Okay, it's a little bit bright in here. And this is a project he's just finished on the Niger Delta. Oil exploitation in the Niger Delta. So just to talk a little bit about how we actually built the network, or we built the community. We very much followed, to be honest with you, Etienne's sort of guidelines here. Thanks, it's probably okay. This is, as some of you may know, this is Etienne at the Mediating Boundaries event that Jisc helped us do back in May this year, which is a great kind of one-day event where we sort of play with lots of these ideas, particularly around boundaries. So the first thing we did is we identified, a group of thought leaders within our practice area, about 12 people. Some of them were personally known to me, they were friends or working colleagues, and some of them were recommended by that little small network. And so I went out and we did a series of interviews, both face-to-face. We had a couple of lunches that we hosted, and then we did some Skype interviews, which we recorded. And from that, we kind of brainstormed the issues. And I was asking questions like, what are the key issues facing our practice industry today? What are the really big problems? What are the big opportunities? What are the new business models? What are the ethical issues? What's the kind of roadmap for our industry at the moment? And from that, we kind of mapped out a landscape, as it were, or a terrain of the questions that we were interested in dealing with. And we kind of came up with the beginnings of an agenda for the first sort of incarnation of the first cycle of the community's activities about what we might want to engage with, what we might want to discuss. And some of the big themes that came out were obviously the impact of digitization, where that's completely changed working methods. A lot was about business models. The old model was you worked for a magazine or a newspaper, and that was pretty much it, and you got your work published in the Sunday Times or wherever. The new model is it's much more open. People are mostly freelance. They're working for a wide variety of different kinds of clients, NGOs, magazines. Some of them are going back to doing wedding photography to survive. It's a much more complex, much more fractured model now. And obviously a major issue that we're facing is the issue around ethics, both in terms of the ethics of digital manipulation, but also more importantly, the ethics of representation. And just to give you an example of the kind of difficulty of the problems we're working with, this is a photograph that we discussed, or an issue we discussed from Haiti. It's a French photographer, took photographs of the sort of basically the removal of the bodies of the victims from Haiti. So this gives you a sense of the kind of complexity of the issues that we're trying to negotiate. The heart of the community, we expected the community to actually have lots of different spaces in which it would interact. In the end, it's pretty much narrowed down to the live webinars being the key focal point of what we do. And we realized quite quickly that there are other spaces where people are discussing things like blogs, for example, have massively taken off in our practice area. There's 4 or 5 or 10 really significant blogs written by professional photographers. They've kind of taken over from discussion forums and other sorts of more text-based, chat-based discussion. So our discussion forums, for example, didn't really take off. But that comes back to the point I was making this morning about being very flexible and being agile and not over-predicting things. And if you've got some things not working, fine, concentrate your efforts somewhere else. So most of our efforts now are concentrated on running these webinars. We typically run them twice a month. They last for about 2 hours each time. And we've tried all sorts of different times of day for them. We've tried all sorts of different days of the week. It doesn't really seem to make a great deal of difference to our attendance. It's typically between 30 and 50 people per session, with a nice mixture of some of them are students, some of them are professional practitioners, some people work with photography, and some people are academics and critics of photography. And we've got quite a nice demographic in that way. When we launched the network, the first 100 or so people we invited were not students. We waited until we built up a sort of sense of enough professionals engaging with it, enough people that people recognized, they knew their names, and it was only after about the first month or two that we started allowing our own students to come into the space, because we were I think it's very careful to manage people's expectations. We didn't want the professional practice area to see this as a student university site, nor did we want the students to see it as we were trying to get free lectures for them to come into their class. So we've been careful with the branding. It's not branded with university branding. There's nowhere on the site that says, UAL, LCC, Jisc, anything like that. It's mentioned, but it's mentioned in a very subtle, quiet way in the kind of about page. So I think one of the key things that we've been able to do, though, as the institution, and this is looking at the university or the academy in a very broader sense. There are a group of academics and people that are engaging with the issues around the practice of being a photojournalist who are not practitioners. And we've been able, I think, and these are not just from my institution, they're from a variety of institutions globally, we've been able to act as what you might call a critical friend to the industry. So collectively, we've been able to ask practitioners some really quite tough questions about why you're doing what you're doing, how you're doing what you're doing, what are the issues, what are the implications of that. And so we've been able to really, act, as I say, as this kind of critical friend. I think that's a great role for the university to act. You're not necessarily going to be getting anything out of it directly, but you are able to kind of interrogate the professional practice arena in a very, very interesting way.